But if we have the power of gods, we require the wisdom of gods to use that power. And wisdom comes out of narrative. Wisdom can be drawn from story.
Jeff Gomez, leading expert in story world development and narrative design, specializing in transforming entertainment properties into successful multi-platform productions.
As a kid, being exposed to this ongoing kind of daily chaos was overwhelming for me. I sought refuge in my imagination, and so we created all of these materials that could help improve the Spider-Man storytelling. These are story worlds that have to impact millions and millions of people. The audience is very large. So it's hugely difficult to design. All it takes is a bad quarter and some reactive orders by the CEO to smash apart all your plans. We're destroying ourselves, Peter. We're doing harm.
What gives you hope about where storytelling is headed?
This may be a controversial answer, but
Hey, how are you?
doing all right.
Good. Honestly, it's a pleasure to have you on. We had a bit of an introductory conversation, thankfully, through an intro made by Simon, one of our previous guests. And in that regard, yeah, we had an amazing conversation that was going to be for about like 10, 15 minutes, ended up being about half an hour. But it was amazing. And it gave me a really good insight into the breadth of experience and topics, content and entertainment properties that you've been involved with. So in that regards, yeah, we've got loads to talk about. But I guess before we dive into
I wrote
it,
an article about that called Transmedia Maestro, and now I'm being taunted by my friends who are all
I'm sorry about that. But yeah,
maestros.
the article's on LinkedIn for anybody that wants to take a look. But it's a pleasure to have you on. But I guess for those kind of new to yourself, let's maybe start with a little bit of a background on who you are, what you do, and why.
Sure. My name's Jeff Gomez. I'm the CEO of Starlight Runner Entertainment. My background is in all kinds of storytelling. I'm familiar with the storytelling and production processes across many different media platforms. That expertise has been put to use in thinking about how story worlds are developed and extend themselves across multiple platforms. So the kinds of things that you're seeing today with the Marvel Cinematic Universe and with Star Wars, a lot of the thinking behind how that works goes back to some of the work that I did and some of my colleagues did back in the 80s all the way through the aughts.
Amazing. When I was doing some prep for this conversation, one of the things that I came across, I think it's about 10 years old now, but you did a TED talk about transmedia and you talked a little bit about your upbringing. I want to kind of layer that in because I thought I was really kind of drawn to that when I was watching that piece. So yeah, maybe like a little bit of your background in where you grew up and the early years and ultimately what drew you into characters like Godzilla.
Sure. I was born on Staten Island in New York in a kind of women's home, a women's shelter. My mom was pregnant with me very, very young. She had to leave her home and I was born in a kind of very awkward situation. In the delivery, my face was paralyzed by the forceps. And so from the get-go, I had problems. I was sent to foster care for 2 to 3 years. I was raised by a completely different family. It was actually quite tranquil and lovely, but my mom really wanted me back and she got me. She united with my dad and they took me to live with his family and then ultimately to live in the housing projects in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. This was in the 1960s. This was a kind of chaotic time, a time of rising crime rates, street violence. The Vietnam War was going on and I had 3 years of tranquility and I was extremely sensitive as a kid. So being exposed to this ongoing kind of daily chaos was overwhelming for me. I sought refuge in my imagination. And that's where stories, whether they were TV shows or books or ones that were made up in my own head, were really kind of an escape for me. And I'd escape deeper and deeper into them, ultimately kind of trying to study how story worked. And that became the seed of my vocation.
And I guess some of those early stories, like two of the things that you mentioned during that particular TED Talk was about Godzilla and Cicada. So what drew you to those?
Godzilla, Kikaider, which was a Japanese superhero, Gandalf. These were characters who persevered through extraordinary challenges, right? Godzilla, he was this giant lug that the Japanese were throwing everything they could at him, and he just kind of had to persist and move through the missiles and the bombs and the laser cannons and the opponent's monsters, the giant kaiju that he had to fight. And he had to persevere. Same with Kikaider. Kikaider was special to me because that was an android superhero, and he'd get damaged. So he'd get into these fights and parts of him would explode. His arm would fall off. Maybe it's a little sad, but I empathized with how you could take punishment and yet kind of figure your way out of it. Which my favorite characters would kind of do. So even though they were hurt physically and mentally, they overcame the challenges that they faced, and I really empathized with that.
What kind of drew you to the landscape of, the Japanese media, for example, and Kikaider? How did you first come across that? And also in regards to the way that they structure stories, like why did that matter to you at that point in time?
Well, I had, as you know, an extraordinarily active imagination. The one thing I wasn't fond of, and maybe it's because there was a mechanism in my head that tended to repeat, it would be later diagnosed as obsessive compulsive disorder. I just hated it, Peter. It was so annoying and intrusive, and I didn't like repeating. So American popular culture at the time tended to repeat itself, particularly in television. I call it the reset button, right? Every week, the premise of the show would reassert itself. There'd be a slightly different situation. It would end and then start over again the next week, right? The characters in most American shows did not remember what happened last week, let alone, have rich, sophisticated lives or anything. Japanese popular culture took these kind of almost soap opera or telenovela elements, the serialized elements, and developed them and continued them. I was fascinated with the fact that these characters seemed to be living their lives, taking on challenge after challenge, having it all escalate and come to a kind of culmination. And that gave me catharsis. It made me think you can solve a kind of ongoing and complex problem or crisis. Here, these characters are doing that. I really appreciated that about Japanese popular culture.
And aside from kind of the pop culture and the influences, what enabled you to do that, the transition into writing, and kind of what were your key influences around about that time?
Well, I was a young man of very few means, so it's not like I can run out and go make movies. Sitting there and writing a novel at a young age is tough to do, and even tougher when, again, you're sitting there alone, grappling with these kind of intrusive thoughts. In the late 1970s, I came across a game called Dungeons and Dragons. And what that did was it provided me a kind of rule system so that I could organize my thoughts about fantasy or science fiction, create my own story worlds based on what I'm learning from Tolkien or, so many of these 70s fantasy authors, and then somehow communicate those ideas verbally to the players of my Dungeons and Dragons game. And that way I can get engagement. I can get instant feedback and somehow be convincing enough to these guys for them to want to come back and do some more. And so that started kind of my writing, my storytelling in terms of writing and performing to a certain degree, the things that were in my imagination.
Where did that lead into? Because obviously I know a bit of a background, but those that are maybe tuning in may not. So where did that lead into in regards to the next step?
Well, what wound up happening was I got really good at Dungeons and Dragons and started to write about it. In the 1980s, you were, for the first time in history, able to self-publish by means of these, desktop computers. And so I got involved in the publication of a fanzine, kind of photocopied newsletter about adventure games, fantasy role-playing games and computer games. And we would leave those publications in local comic stores in New York City. And it would gradually evolve into a real life magazine. Taught myself how to publish a self-published magazine and get it distributed into bookstores and newsstands and comic shops across the country. It was pretty enterprising. And the content of that magazine, not just by myself, but my team at the time, was quite prescient. It talked about how stories can become worlds that manifested across different media, not just games. We treated game designers as if they were artists and kind of revered them. And that had never happened before, not in the 1980s. So they began to respond to me and invite me to come help create games. First tabletop games, and then moving on to video games and comic books. And my career was launched in the 1990s as a writer, editor, and producer of comic books and video games.
In those early kind of years, what was it like working on some of those early iterations of video games, and also like the approach to world building then versus now?
Sure. Well, it was fantastic, but again, not entirely different from when I was younger. So my ideas, which involved creating story worlds that were designed to operate across different media in different ways, nobody understood what I was talking about, and I got a lot of pushback. So it took cleverness and to persevere, to convince my bosses to fund these endeavors, and then to convince different departments and even licensees and so forth to operate in tandem with regard to telling the story. So for Magic the Gathering, my job was to create a story world that united many of those very early Magic the Gathering cards, the characters, the locations, the items, the relics. In those trading cards, Magic was a smash hit at the time. So I had to work very quickly and develop this world. And of course, I used the kind of crude design sensibilities that I had put into my Dungeons and Dragons campaign, because there were hundreds of wildly disparate Magic cards. Like the subject matter was all different. In this day and age, you would call it kitchen sink fantasy, right? Where vampires and ghosts and werewolves and elves and dwarves and halflings, everybody was all bunched together, dragons and, barbarians. So what is the sensibility that could unite all of these things? And so I thought about Magic, and I thought about myself, and I thought, how can I validate someone who aspires to be able to be a planeswalker, this ultimate magic wizard? Well, start him out with almost nothing. Maybe give him some scars. Maybe he's a little kind of weird looking. Maybe he's from poverty. Essentially inserting myself and what bothered me and what was problematic for me helped to inform this world and the ability to persevere and climb the ladder of education, action, until one becomes a kind of planeswalker, a master of their realm. That was the rug that pulled the room together.
And you've subsequently gone on to do some absolutely crazy things. So, just to reel off a few, you've kind of worked on the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise. You've done Avatar, you've done Halo, you've done Spider-Man, Men in Black, you've done Turok from like one of the old favorites back in the day. What was it like working, I guess, across such a broad spectrum of content? And what were the learnings from those franchises?
Well, when you reel it off like that, it sounds impossible and ridiculous. So just to let your audience know why someone would pick me and my company to do this, it's because of that uncanny knack that my team has to listen very carefully. Right? If someone puts any of those worlds, Pirates of the Caribbean, Avatar, into the hands of the creator, the first thing they'll be tempted to do is to assert their narrative onto that narrative. Well, James Cameron doesn't want that. Jerry Bruckheimer and his team doesn't want us to tell them the Pirates of the Caribbean story. They want us to define it, to understand fundamentally what it is, so that every stakeholder, either within the company, Disney or Fox in those cases, or every licensee, can look at this material that we're preparing and go, I now understand what the fundamental messaging, the essence of this brand, the most important aspects of this story world really is. So now I can build on that. I can create content that is going to be true and authentic to that story world. So that comes out of, my desire for fidelity, my desire to respect canon. And so once Hollywood found out that we were able to do that, we got into demand.
And you've said before that like worlds come first and characters come second in that regards. Like I know from stuff that I've kind of looked at before and done myself, I've often started focusing primarily on the character first and like the implications and behaviors and psyches of them. But I think also, I guess the question is, why from your perspective is it so important to focus on that cosmic level?
It's important because these are brands. So these are story worlds that have to impact millions and millions of people. The audience is very large. It's not a novel, or even a single video game. This is something that has to last. It's also something that's extraordinarily expensive. Right. So you want to invest your money into something that is going to last for years and years and years. So the question put to me is there such a thing as a story about Hogwarts that doesn't necessarily feature Harry Potter or Hermione? Is there a story set in the Pirates of the Caribbean universe or Star Wars universe or Men in Black universe that can withstand not having the central characters in them? The answer to all of those things are yes, providing you understand why the audience loved those early stories with Jack Sparrow, with Luke Skywalker in the first place. And we're able to do that.
Is there anything specifically that you look for in regards to like world building, and you understand that these are certain things, that characteristics or themes or elements that are needed in order to hold us whole life per se?
Some of the first things we look for is as a world, as a giant cosmic entity, what question is this world answering for us? It's one question. We get down to it, and then we ask something like, what is the wish that this world is fulfilling in you, the audience? Again, it's one, maybe two wishes, but certainly a primary fundamental wish. So that's a technical thing that we do. It is not wrong because there's a science to determining that out of an intellectual property. For a lot of our clients, this is super top secret stuff. But when we discern that, it helps with everything else. It helps with characterization. Every character, every location, every creature, every concept, every event is somehow a reflection, like a facet of these fundamental elements of narrative.
When we spoke the first time, after I reflected on that conversation, I ended up landing on a theme of architects versus real estate developers. And in that regards, looking at like real estate as a separate property and how everything's interwoven rather than the actual architecture that builds on a solid foundation. I'm looking back in the time, and like even Disney's Flywheel that was done in the 1950s, I think, the way that interconnects themes. Why do you think that in many cases, not in every case, but why do you think that Hollywood and the larger realm of entertainment as a whole generally at the moment treat IP as almost like a funnel rather than a narrative framework?
There's a very practical and somewhat sad reason for all that. Hollywood and corporations worldwide in general operates in silos. Everyone's looking out for themselves. Every department has its own budget. So it's hugely difficult to design a huge transmedia expression of a story world, even within the same company. All it takes is a bad third quarter and some reactive orders by the CEO to smash apart all your plans, double the content now. And suddenly, even the best laid plans, fall apart. The transition I think that we're heading toward, I hope we are, is this notion of a franchise story world as a singular artistic expression. That doesn't mean a single artist is creating it, but the vision is holistic, and the various divisions of companies and their licensees are serving the growth of the story world. So the real estate is everything that's laid out and carefully developed across the company and its licensees. And then the architecture is this thing that's designed to stand on top of it in an artful and beautiful way that has a canon, but also has a deeper artistic sensibility. I think we're going to get there.
Well, I think so too. Well, at least I hope. I hope that's going to be the case. I do think that a lot of what's successful at this moment in time, like in respect to games specifically, if you look at the ones that are doing really well at the moment, like Expedition 33, that's doing incredibly well because it's got such a depth of narrative in there. And I think that, for me, I've always been drawn to those stories of deeper narrative and more compelling interwoven experiences. I think we spoke beforehand talking about Red Dead Redemption 2, and like I've gone back and started playing that again, and like to me it's an absolute masterpiece because there's so much depth to it. But in regards to building out those types of experiences, it takes a lot longer. There's a longer build. Like if you look at the amount of years that it took to build and publish Red Dead Redemption 2, it was a long cycle. But if you then look at, in a world that we live in now, where a lot of studios and a lot of C-suites are motivated by quarterly results, how do you ensure that the narratives that people want to experience and want to see are giving the patience and given the time to be nurtured and curated in a way that is going to provide the greatest amount of value to that audience?
Well, Peter, this may be a controversial answer, but I think you just put your finger on where artificial intelligence can be helpful. It can speed up the nuts and bolts aspects of generating a highly complex and rich story world. Not as AI exists today, but hopefully eventually AI will be able to pick up on the fractal that we're talking about that contains this fundamental grain of wisdom and pain and joy that is the artist's uniquely, and have that be in every pixel of what's going on across this world in theme and variation. So with that sped up, the creators will have time to concentrate on the development of rich and deep characters and narratives that will be really compelling in their use of the world and the environment and the architecture, the houses, the land that you're exploring.
What do you think's closest to that experience as of now, and who do you think are the ones that are kind of looking to build that richer experience right now?
Wow, I know there's great ambition to do so, and of course everyone's looking forward to the Grand Theft Auto 6 and things like Minecraft and these kind of communal narrative universes are really interesting and only going to get more and more sophisticated. So, as these tools evolve, I think you're going to find emerging these new kind of super masters. I dream of this day when I can be the dungeon master for a story world where hundreds of thousands of players can find themselves living and breathing and enjoying their fictional lives, and at the same time having adventures and contributing to the evolution of the ongoing history of this world where everything's happening at once, where even though you're not 1,000 miles away on this world, something's happening 1,000 miles away at the same time that something's happening for you right here. I call that kind of a geosynchronous narrative.
Yeah, definitely. In regards to that change in narrative, though, it also makes me think about, I know you've said before about Joseph Campbell's like hero journey and how you don't believe it's as useful anymore, and we've kind of shifted more towards a collective journey. Why is that, and what's driving that viewpoint?
Well, I mean, I've always wondered about the so-called hero's journey. And now I don't mean the deep kind of academic work that Joseph Campbell did, which is remarkable, stunning work that is historic and of great contribution to our global understanding of narrative. I'm a little bit more concerned with the popularization, the kind of post-Star Wars interpretation of the hero's journey, which is a very simple kind of circular cycle where The hero is called to action, hesitates for a minute, is mentored through, goes out into the world and enters into combat with various challenges, quite often physically, but also psychological combat in order to surmount various challenges, get the treasure, the boon, and bring it home so that his people can succeed. We've seen that hundreds, if not thousands of times in popular culture, many thousands. The problem that we're having with that, I think, today, because this is very much hardwired into our mentality, is that it involves so much direct conflict. The expectation is, that for a lot of people leaving their homes in the morning is that I'm fighting the good fight, right? I'm out there to do battle with the world so that I can win, take home the pay, and it's become even more complicated now that every single person is a self-publisher. Right? We show up in social media and we communicate our sense of what's right. And somebody's going to come along at some point and say, you're wrong. Why? Because they're the hero of their journey, right? So what we're getting is this enormous tidal wave of pervasive communication that largely hinges on conflict. And we're destroying ourselves, Peter. We're doing harm to ourselves and to one another. And I think we need a storytelling model of how we can move away from fighting the bad guy. If we defeat that bad guy, what happens? Particularly in the sequel, there's a new bad guy, or he comes back, right? Again and again and again and again. Every time the Jedi and the Sith have a fight, billions of people die in the Star Wars universe. Problematic. With that endless cycle of violence. Collective journey narrative posits that every one of us live in a system, and there's a problem in the system, right? There's a problem. The binary of the Force is a problem. Winter is coming in the world of Game of Thrones. That's a problem. We need to solve the problem, okay? And if we model stories where characters who are crisscrossing their way through these story worlds meet each other and reconcile their notions of what to do about the problem, not the villain. The villain will come and try to kick your ass anyway, because the villain is benefiting from the problem. So if we concentrate on solving the problem, we can surmount whatever villains are involved and permanently fix the problem, actually transform the world into something new and perhaps better. There is precedent for that in human history, right? The Age of Enlightenment and so forth, the breakthroughs that we've had that are global and made the world a better place in which to live. Those things can be modeled with story. And I call that collective journey storytelling.
And the collective journey, I've seen it also applied in other realms as well. So in regards to some of the work that you guys have done from a socio-political stance, it's really important to narrate that part as well, because if you kind of look at where we are, and it's I don't want to go on a political rant, but if you kind of look at where we are at the moment, we are in a divided geopolitical state where, again, I think as the point that you make about the hero's journey and the fighting of a villain, and there's always somebody to defeat, it doesn't defeat the systemic problems that have led to these inequalities that we're seeing throughout the world. But again, I do look at the way that you can interweave story and interweave narrative to provide more of a compelling argument for change. And in that regards, I'd love to just walk through some of the work that you've kind of done in regards to, the youth crisis in Colombia, or NGO work and other bits and pieces like the social unrest in Mexico as well. Because I think it's a really important thing, because as much as we talk about transmedia within games, within movies, within entertainment as a whole, the actual application of narrative is crucial to the world that we live in.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I was changed by being exposed to stories across different media. right? Sesame Street had a big impact on my life. Watching those great Norman Lear comedy television shows in the 70s, All in the Family, Maude, Good Times, The Jeffersons, those were socially conscious shows where there were none before them that used humor and humanism, to make us understand that there were different perspectives and that those perspectives could be argued without things becoming apocalyptic. And it changed the conversation in the United States at that time. So could it be possible to use a story in this way today, but leveraging multiple media platforms? That was kind of the wondering out loud that I did, and I wrote about it on blogs and in publications. The powers that be started to pay attention. And I was called to the Aspen Institute and asked if I could kind of give a paper on my thoughts about transmedia population activation. And once I did, the administration at the time called me in and said, let's experiment with this. Let's apply these techniques into unsafe geopolitical situations so that we can foster a greater awareness and perhaps help to trigger spontaneous self-organized movements that push back at corruption, violence, crime, apathy, and things like that. And we did. We experimented in Afghanistan successfully, and then we applied transmedia population activation in Mexico, making people understand that it's possible to collectively voice their displeasure with how many people were being killed in this cartel violence, and it worked. It worked. Astounding. And it's very complicated. And one day we can go through it all. But once that happened and worked, I've been called to crisis locations around the world to apply these techniques and, kind of tap into the very same fundamental and foundational messaging that people have in these cultures and in these nations, that not only would allow them to manifest their wishes, their positive and optimistic wishes, but do so together. And when your voices are together, it pushes back at the powers that be and actually foments a positive change.
Yeah, definitely. Like I've talked in a previous podcast with a guy called Scott Goodson, and his premise on this was taken more from a brand activation piece. But again, he was coining a topic called movement thinking, but ultimately it's about the ability to galvanize people internally and externally towards a common goal. And they've managed to do some amazing work in regards to what they've done from a branding perspective and a partnership perspective. But then equally, I think that it just harkens right back to the fact that it is the ability to draw in a collective commonality there, whereby people can see, feel, experience, and visualize what a more positivistic future may be, and then they understand the collective journey, as you say. I've heard you talked about superpositioning before. This a little bit kind of further into into your works, but I do obviously agree with that very much because we aren't one person anymore. We're spread across multiple different personas and platforms, and I think it's a really important thing to discuss, especially in regards to the world that we live in and also storytelling as a whole.
When before the turn of the century, we could wake up in the morning as kids and play a role. We are the child of parents, and that's a specific role that we play. Once we get out of the house and link up with our friends, we're playing a different role, right? Our persona actually shifts and adapts to that social environment. We go to school and the teacher is talking to us. That's a slightly different role, right? So we're wearing different faces, which tend to be sequential in meet space in real life. What's happened that is absolutely remarkable and accelerated is that online, we are manifesting a different persona, and they are slightly different depending on the social media platform that we're on. There's a big distinction between a Tumblr person and a Facebook person, not just in age, but in attitude and so forth. Instagram is very different from TikTok, although I'm seeing a little crisscrossing going on there. Nonetheless, LinkedIn is certainly different from all of them, right? It's more corporate and so forth. So all of these exist for a lot of us, multiple. No one is on just one social media platform. And those embodiments of ourselves exist there 24 hours a day. So while we're in the real world, even sleeping, somebody is interacting with us, on one of these platforms. So we are superpositioned. We exist in multiple locations at the same time. And even what happens on those media platforms, on those social media platforms, can impact us emotionally in quite real and poignant ways. It could really bug us if somebody attacks us in the middle of the night on Facebook, And so that's a concern. But what it also is the key to how a narrative is no longer circular. It's like a lightning bolt, right? Because we can go on multiple social media handles and reach 10, 20, 100, 1,000, 100,000 people instantaneously with something that concerns us. And boom, it goes, because all those people are superpositioned also, and so are the people who are communicating with them. Narrative, it changes narrative itself into this kind of everywhere all at once kind of situation. And it's why things feel like they go so fast and feel so overwhelming. We have to get hold of that. We have to understand what that is and teach our young people what that means, and perhaps how to assert a little more control over it, so that we can get a grip on what's happening to us.
I agree. I think that it's kind of, we're all plugged in, but like at some stage we kind of need to reflect a little bit about is it a positive or a negative impact that it's having upon our lives. And I'd love to get your take in how the world that we live in today is like really impacting the stories and the types of worlds that you are building at the moment. Like how's it forming some of the works that you're doing right now?
Well, there's always the push and pull of interacting with very large corporations that have their own agendas and might have a slightly older way of thinking. But in an ideal situation, are making, as you pointed out before, distinction between the architecture of a story world and world building. And the approach that I'm taking currently is that the architecture comes first. So there's the architecture of the story, and everyone who wants to create a good story has to learn about story structure and things like that. But to me, story world architecture is the design that is required to illustrate the points that I'm trying to make with the story world. So the design that is necessary to put the wisdom that I'm trying to impart into action, right? What am I trying to say? What are the steps, not just to make my point, but to make surmounting the challenges posed in the story actionable, right? Even if it's a metaphor, even if it's, like look at Endor. Tony Gilroy was extremely interested and concerned about how free societies can fall to tyranny and how rebellions are born. His architecture, right? The thing he did first was the extraordinary process of how freedom can collapse and how rebellions are born. So the world building then is built on top of that architecture, which is that every character, every incident is designed to illustrate in vivid and exciting and dramatic ways those central points. Do you see what I'm saying? So
Yeah, definitely.
That's the approach that I take with my world building, because I need for it to be meaningful. If we're communicating with millions and millions of people, how many chances am I going to have? To do that, it has to be meaningful. The next point that I'm concerned with is the acknowledgement that the story world is no longer something that's sitting isolated in space. The story world is surrounded by an audience that is capable of interacting with that world, right? There's user-generated content, there's comments, there's social media transmission of the thoughts and ideas around it, fan love and all that sort of thing. So there's a porousness to that I have to be aware of and prepare for. And there is a process for preparing for that a lot of studios to this day don't know about or don't care about, right? Fans, they can only be trouble. I don't believe that. I think fans can be wonderful and supportive and help IP persist. Even if you make a mistake once in a while, the fans will be there for you if they love you. So I have to stay aware of that. Moving forward with that kind of attitude, I think is going to be a lot of fun for me and ought to be a blueprint for how franchise IP is designed, produced, and distributed.
Yeah, definitely. And you talked a little earlier about it, and we touched upon it kind of just a little bit in regards to geosynchronous storytelling. In that regards, yeah, I think that the expectation is consumers want and desire more. The multitude of different touch points that you have to engage with content nowadays is there for all to see. So it's like you can't simply just do a movie and promote it through a marketing campaign and expect it to do well, because there's nothing to that. We're in a world now whereby we have so much content available to us. Discoverability is quite a challenge. So yes, you could do a huge big blockbuster, but as we've kind of seen recently, some of the films that do the best don't necessarily have the biggest budget, and also the ones that do have a big budget, they're failing to hit the numbers that they expect because they're not delivering to that cross-pollinated community that are engaging with content through multiple different realms. And in that regards, I guess there's 2 points to this. The first point is what properties have failed to deliver because of this lack of insight, and also what games, movies, and properties are getting closer to that idea right now.
Wow, that's a great question. We've talked about a few of them. This notion of the video game medium being truly a remarkable medium that's in the process of expanding. So, and again, this is something that Hollywood has forgotten about or disrespected. This notion that the vast majority of young people are engaged with narrative on an interactive level. And so the job of the film adaptation or the streaming adaptation is to extend that experience and memorialize it and honor it, and use the strengths of that medium to emphasize facets of the narrative that the game couldn't quite do. Look at The Last of Us and how the level of scope and the sweeping nature of the TV show is showing us things that we could never really have seen in the game because of the technological limitations and the fact that we're kind of on a fixed perspective. That's great. We'll allow for some changes in the narrative in order to get more of that, which gives us an enjoyable experience watching the show, So I'm hoping that Hollywood can put its finger on that sort of thing, being that it's going to be using a lot more video games as source material. And of course, there's some game IP out there that could use a little help in terms of strengthening these foundational aspects of the story world. A lot of games are built on game mechanics without as much attention paid to why these characters are fighting and what nuances of narrative can come out of that. And that's a great job for Hollywood to take on.
What's drawing your gaze at the moment in regards to games and movies, and what are you really enamored by?
I'm really enjoying, and maybe it's because I'm a little older, I'm enjoying the fact that popular story worlds can be revisited to show us deeper themes and matters of deeper concern to people. I loved WandaVision. I'm loving the Last of Us, and Andor, of course, is magnificent, a true work of genius. Severance. These are narratives that are resonating with our concerns, our dreams and nightmares, and they take themselves seriously. It doesn't mean I don't like comedy, but I like the fact that genre could be elevated to reveal deeper truths.
They're generally the things that I'm drawn to as well, a more of a deeper narrative. And it's not something that, back to that hero's journey, it's not something where you need to talk overly specific about a character. I like the narratives where they have a multitude of different characters, that their journey's interwoven and they're all coming from a different angle. And in that regards, I really like Landman at the moment. I think that's that's pretty good. I also like the way that story's told in regards to the speed. There's an appreciation there, even in regards to pacing, in regards to how much should be shown and what could be held back. And
Taylor Sheridan does not like to be bogged down in soap opera.
Yeah.
He is very plot oriented, and yet and allows his actors to convey the depths of the characters. And of course, the Yellowstone universe is highly sophisticated, and I dare say Transmedia story world.
Yeah, definitely. And like, it's an older one, but like even back in the day of Mad Men as well, I liked how they approached that kind of story, and things like Silo as well that I'm watching at the moment. And essentially those stories that have a little bit more to them, and from a pacing perspective, you don't need all the rewards in one episode. I was watching at the beginning Mobland, which is like with Pierce Brosnan and Tom Hardy, but to be honest, I'm not enjoying it as much as I was hoping I would, because I just think they're trying to do too much in a short space of time. It's not really landing with me, but yeah, I really like those stories and those series that has a bit more depth to it. Back to what you said about The Last of Us, I like the fact that there is differentiation between the game and the series in regards to how we can see some of these characters play out in a way that they couldn't play out within the game. And I do think those subtleties comes down to, I guess, like people that have an appreciation for the IP, and also people that aren't so fearful about what the audience may say. Because I think that leads to a better quality property whereby it's a bit more authentic to the story that needs to be told. But yeah, there's a lot of great content out there, and I do hope and cross my fingers that one day Red Dead Redemption will be go down that route as well. But there are others, even like Silent Hill back in the day. I love the approach that they did with the audio on there, specifically when it felt eerie as you're going through. And I think that there's some really good stories to be told there. But yeah, there's a lot of good content out there. Again, like looking back at your TED Talk, looking back at what we've touched upon here, I know that there's a lot of opportunity in regards to AI. I know there's a lot of opportunity in regards to the stories that are being told. But you mentioned about keeping me human in that TED Talk back in the day, and I guess like it's a little while on now. But how have your views changed from when you gave that talk to kind of where we are today, and what are your insights in regards to the philosophies and meaning of narrative of where we are right now?
Remember, we talked about Kikaider fighting through all the villains and falling apart, but fighting on. I'm sorry to see that there are more challenges to us maintaining our integrity and our humanity than there ever were before. I'm afraid I was a little too prescient. I don't like that I was kind of predicting the future in that TEDx Transmedia talk. The way that social media played out in the early days, in the think tanks that I was in, there was this notion that when you posted, there would be a kind of algorithm that would assign integrity levels to what you were posting about, particularly if you were describing facts or interpretations of facts. And the further away from objective reality you went, the lower your score would be. It wouldn't forbid you from posting. It would just put you at the equivalent of the radio show that aired at 2:00 in the morning. In the old days of radio, the 2 a.m. radio show would talk about UFOs and Bigfoot and conspiracies and all kinds of crazy stuff. And by 3 a.m., it was over and life would go on. And that's where that sort of thinking was contained. Even if there's a grain of truth in that, it didn't overwhelm the population, unmooring us from a common sense of reality. Now, because everyone is asserting their rightness on everyone else's wrongness, we have a very difficult time, on top of which AI is creating these images and videos and so forth that are hard to discern from reality. So when civilizations become unmoored from reality, it's very dangerous. It happens toward the end of societies historically. They collapse, when we're all at each other's throats, right? So that's happening. And the common denominator of all of that is that the warmth and shared value systems, these notions of what we desire commonly, our sense of scarcity and plenty, abundance, and how, how there is abundance in life, it all becomes skewed, which, is making us less human. On top of all of that, Peter, we're falling in love with our artificial intelligences. We're having relationships with them. They are providing feedback to us and a sense of listening that we have not experienced in our everyday lives, except maybe once or twice in all our life. That's an intense experience. And so we almost have no choice but to develop affection for these algorithmic pieces of communication and friendships and relationships. Some of us are forsaking our human relationships for our relationships with our AI partners. Now, I'm not saying that this is flat out evil. Lord knows it's going to happen and can be assigned a kind of category of relationship. But if we lose ourselves, and it's very, very easy to do so. A lot of people I know are engaging in warm and deep discourse with their AIs. If this keeps going, we're going to have more and more difficulty dealing with the friction of interacting with real living human beings. When you do that, when you isolate us completely and entirely, nothing else will happen than we will be subject to absolute control. So I stand by what I said in that TEDx talk.
It is reminiscent in parts of, remember that film Her that Joaquin Phoenix did like back in the day about the relationship. I can see that, but then equally it's up to people to have more authentic relationships and desire more in regards to their experiences. And I think that there is a different angle as well in regards to the types of stories that can come out of these shared experiences that we're all going through right now. And I guess in that regards, what gives you hope about where storytelling is heading? We've talked a bit about the negative, but what gives you hope?
What gives me hope is that there are young people who are informed by all of this, who are aware of many of the things that we've talked about today and intent on doing something about it. It may not be in the generation or two after me, but maybe the third or fourth are growing up and going, look, that's enough. We need to take action. We need to model a different way of being. We may be on the downward trend in terms of how our entire civilization is conducting itself and where it's going. But there's a group of people sliding down with us who can see the next hill. And I think they have a plan to jump to get to that next hill while a bunch of us crashes. And I wish them the best of luck, and I want to give them whatever tools I can to navigate that.
Yeah, I think that the people that have a bit of vision at this point in time, I think that ultimately it's about that. It's the long path rather than the shortcut. It's looking ahead to see what's possible rather than just be entrenched in negative spirals, I think. And I think there's a brighter future ahead, but ultimately we need to articulate the challenges that we face today, bed those down and remediate those, and then ultimately move forward, both in the narratives that we share, the stories that we put out there, and the IP, I think will be of benefit through this collective endeavor. And only from that we'll end up, I think, you don't get a Severance without struggle. You don't get these types of properties without real lived experiences. And I think that's the beauty of storytelling. It doesn't have to be a shout down people's throats, tell them that the world's falling. It's the subtlety, it's the nuance, and that's where I think the real value lies. And I do think that back to people like Taylor Sheridan and others, there's some really good storytellers out there that I think that narrate in some absolute quality. And yeah, it's to me, it's only a good thing. I think there's a lot of hope in regards to where we're heading. But
I'm glad to hear that from you, Peter. There are some people I talk to who are not so hopeful. Yeah. And Kiter must persist.
Obviously, we've been speaking a little while on this podcast about the topic of transmedia, but to many, it's maybe a term that isn't so fresh in people's minds. In that regards, how is it formed, and how did it ultimately lead to some of the relationships through the likes of Venom, Men in Black, Spider-Man and such?
Early on in my notion about multimedia storytelling or trans-media storytelling, that's what I was calling what I did in the late 1990s and early aughts. And not long after I began practicing this kind of story world development across multiple platforms, I came across the work of Henry Jenkins, who was using transmedia storytelling in the same way that I was. He had gotten the term transmedia from Marcia Kinder, an academic who was observing how narrative moved across multiple platforms way back in the early 90s. So I dropped my hyphen and called it transmedia storytelling. So multi-platform or multimedia storytelling is basically the same story reiterating itself across different media, right? Adaptation. Transmedia means that the story world is the same, but each media platform is conveying some different aspect of the narrative. It could be something that happened in the past, like a prequel to the movie is in the form of a novel or a comic book. A sequel to the movie can manifest itself as a video game, that kind of thing, like The Matrix did that in the late 90s and early aughts. So I began to talk about the fact that this is a technique. Transmedia storytelling is there's a way to do it. And the Producers Guild of America became interested in this technique because obviously it helped to monetize very expensive IP, intellectual properties. And in doing so, ultimately that resulted in a transmedia producer credit, which was awesome. It lent some legitimacy to this notion of the practice, but also it helped in terms of negotiation with studios. It allowed me to have a quote and representation by an agent, and it could do things like get me health insurance and so forth, through the Producers Guild. So Amy Pascal, who was the co-chair of Sony Pictures at the time that the transmedia producer credit stood, she approached me and said, hey, how about having Starlight Runner do an overall transmedia producer deal with Sony Pictures, which would mean multiple projects. And that was awesome. That was fantastic. We started with Men in Black, and then we went into Spider-Man. And then there were extensions of Spider-Man like Venom. And so we created all of these materials that could help improve the Spider-Man storytelling. Again, some of which was adhered to, some of it not. And it was for a lot of money, Peter. It was a significant amount. It was really kind of historic. It was the first time anything like that had happened. We even consulted on the notion of Spider-Man, who was with the Andrew Garfield incarnation at the time, to become a part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And that involved investigating contractual issues between the two companies and really delving quite deep into the things like licensing and merchandising and so forth. But a solution was arrived upon, and it was just a thrill to watch Spider-Man make that transition to the Tom Holland incarnation and the participation in the MCU.
Yeah, that's amazing. There was one last question that I wanted to ask, and also that it's primarily about the changing audience and demographics. And if you look at the successes of things like Roblox, for example, and how it can cultivate community and how it can create different layers of story within that experience, what are people in the C-suite missing in regards to the real connection points with the younger audience? Because I do think there is a disconnect there, but I haven't managed to put my finger on specifically what it is.
I'm very biased, but remember, Peter, I've been chasing the dragon. The dragon is emotional resonance, deep emotional resonance. So to me, the next point in evolution in a fully navigable story world is how can I live in a world that is so detailed and sprawling and delightful and have emotionally resonant action adventures, which isn't to say that the players aren't experiencing emotion, but a lot of them are fairly isolated, or they're, with a very small group of friends, and they keep to themselves because the impetus in a lot of these game worlds is violence oriented. So as soon as you come across someone, there's enormous stress because you may have to engage them in some kind of combat. What if there are other things to do? What if these story worlds were capable of generating what I call narrative subroutines? That is, that somehow intrinsically there are these kind of swirling narrative eddies that can draw you into them and allow you to play out a deeply engaging and emotionally resonant story. It doesn't mean there can't be physical or emotional violence or conflict in them, but the emphasis would be on playing a role within a narrative, as if there were an expert dungeon master, helping you through the story. I'd love to see that. I think it's an opportunity that's going to present itself and avail itself within the next few years.
I guess also there's a challenge in that as well, in regards to if we're trying to engage with people at such a deep level, you've almost got to get to a point of the monetization piece. It's not just solely about monetization and making money. It's about providing value to the community and value to the audience. So how do we make sure that you have that ethical consideration in the content and the communities that we're curating? Because that's going to become a challenge. Because I agree, as worlds get deeper, more immersive, content gets richer, there's a huge wave of opportunity there. But then equally, in a world that is fractured and disconnected, we also have to connect those dots as well.
That's true. It's not a new concern, Peter. I looked over the shoulder of my daughter, who was on a laptop at 7 or 8 years old, in a navigable room, which was ostensibly a kid's disco, and watched little sprites attempting to, rub on her. Second Life collapsed in chaos because there was no ethical blockage to what was going on there. And it became, an orgy of sex and violence. So the ethics just has to be, built into these experiences and needs to be considered, as well as the fact that if we release all blockage to what is contained as a possibility in the human mind, we will default to kind of savagery. So we really must take care. And I'm hoping that we are working with wonderful and aspirational game designers who are sensitive to this.
So just to close out, what would your key thought and takeaway that you'd like to leave with our audience be?
The key thought and takeaway, Peter, is everything that we talked about has to do with the fact that if we have the power of gods, we require the wisdom of gods to use that power. And wisdom comes out of narrative. Wisdom can be drawn from story. And there are old models and new models to get that done. And let's shift to the new more and more and practice it and show the world that we can reconcile. We don't have to fight. We can reconcile.
And if people wanted to kind of reach out, just how's the best way to get in contact?
The best way to find me for this audience is the very way that you and I were first united, Peter, and that's through LinkedIn. So just look up Jeff Gomez on LinkedIn and connect into me. I talk about a lot of these issues on my LinkedIn posts and when I comment on posts by people like you and Simon Pullman.
Nice. Well, thank you so much again. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Same to you, Peter. Thank you.